Ravens Vail is a dark fantasy horror anthology podcast that may contain explicit language and thematic elements not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Ravens Vail, a dark fantasy Southern Gothic horror anthology podcast set in the shadowy world of the Deep South. A convergent reality situated around what most of humanity has accepted as the truth. Obscured from human eyes, Ravens Vail is a mystical sanctuary intended to preserve the existence of its immortal inhabitants. The Macquarie, commonly referred to as witches, have been hunted since before written history. The witches of the Highlands fled persecution to a new land that would come to be known as Appalachia. In these parts, you should always be leery of the things that scare witches. The veil is thin tonight, family. Let's see what darkness lies beyond.
Well, hey there, family. Welcome to Ravens Vail's Scary Christmas Holiday Special. Before we get started, we wanted to give you a little trigger warning. This story contains some graphic descriptions of violence and just a tiny bit of gore. As always, remember, listener discretion is very much advised. A little stocking stuffer. Stick around after the credits roll and you might just catch a hidden gem.
Well, hey there, family. Tonight, Jared and I have written an original Christmas story just for you guys to help celebrate the holiday season. Now, it's time I told you about someone special. Mind you, this ain't the good kind of special. You young'uns are about that age where you begin to question traditions, and in many ways, that's a good thing. But tonight, I'm going to tell you about why you should follow some of them. Now, simmer down. I ain't trying to lecture nobody, but I'm going to explain some things to you. Normally, this time of year is about those warm and fuzzy kind of stories where the heart of men overcome the cruelty and indignity of winter. This ain't that kind of story. Make sure you drink your cocoa now, 'cause it'll warm you. You adults, just keep drinking whatever you're drinking. Sugar enough in that, I'm sure. I've told many stories, so I know where to start. Let's start at the beginning. A very long time ago, before the age of humanity, when the Macquarie were still just learning to glint, they met a being unlike any other. Most would describe it as masculine. With sharp features, thin but broad shoulders, taller than most, but still not taller than some, and a tenor voice that resembled that of a young man, perhaps in his late teens. But it ain't no human, nor Macquarie. And there are, as anyone knows, no other like it. So it ain't male. We like to call it a he, but it has no reason to conform to that description, and it can use that to fool you. As these early Macquarie met with the creature, it had no name, because at that time there were few who could speak to it, and the ones that did don't need a mouth or a name to address it. But the Macquarie asked for a name, as was proper, and so it thought about a name, and it chose Frost. A name it still wears today. Weeks turned into months, and for some time, Frost watched as the Macquarie went about their lives. As the seasons changed and the cold gathered in the air, the Macquarie began to create the earliest warmth spells and changed the clothes they wore for heavier furs. Frost one day asked a passing Macquarie why they do these things, and they responded,
"Well, the cold is coming, and we can't live if we are too cold. So we must learn to warm ourselves with fur, fire, and spell."
Frost replied,
I do not do these things. You should not either. For I cannot truly touch anyone if they do these things. Would you keep yourselves from me? From my touch? After I have watched you and told you of the moon and the earth?
The Macquarie frowned and said,
"We've learned of the moon and earth through Rhiannon and Nadira."
Frost growled.
Have I not shown you the cold that watches? The creep of chill as the sun recedes? The hardening of the earth as the days grow short? Have the crops not withered? Has the sun not fled my presence? How could they have shown you more than I? Do they speak to you like I do? Do they stand watch over you for nearly 3 seasons? Would you tell me that I have not shown you care? Yet you turn from my touch.
The Macquarie replied calmly in defiance of the angry creature.
"Frost, you speak of true things, but you make them lies. The sun grew hot before it grew cold while you watched over us. Rhiannon, Nadira, and the others do not speak to us like you do, and they do not ask of us the things you do. You would have us be harmed simply to appease you for something that was not asked of you. Have we not given you food, drink, and company too? Is that not enough for a few seasons of easy observation?"
Frost's power began to bloom within its chest, and true winter began to settle in early that year as the being spoke to the whole settlement of Macquarie with gusts of frosty air carrying its voice.
If you would deny me my due, then you shall not know the peace of frost. In all the nights and through all of the slow falls, long winters and short springs, you will face the bitter cold and lonely quiet dark, and remember the day that you spurned frost.
Moving on from the Macquarie, Frost next visited the Strigoi. Frost followed them through the nights and watched as they fed on the blood of men and beasts. But despite all of Frost's attempts, the Strigoi lacked the vitality needed to speak with the living incarnation of Frost. He spent long years trying to speak to them as they laid themselves to rest during the day and as they made their way through the dark. So Frost cursed them too, so that they would never know the warmth of the bodies they fed on. Leaving behind the disappointment of the Strigoi, Frost visited the anima, but the anima took on the shapes of the furred creatures to avoid his touch. They did not need to wear clothes or start fires to escape Frost's grasp. In a fit of cold rage, Frost said to the anima that the moon they loved so much they would only know to fear. For in the dark cold, whenever it showed full, they would be forced into the forms that they used to hide from Frost. And so they would not know the moon when it was itself not hidden. Frost's fury was an unforgiving force, and when he unleashed it upon mortals, the consequences were devastating. My heart still aches as I recall a tragic and fateful night he took his anger out on humanity. In the middle of a clearing, just outside the small Scottish hamlet known as Creekbriar, sat the home of Matthias Fletcher. Matthias lived a quiet life with his wife Lydia and his daughter Sarah as parson for his small congregation. Shortly after Matthias had built a roaring fire that would last through the night, and Lydia and Sarah had put the sweetbreads in the oven, Matthias and Lydia headed off upstairs to settle in for a long winter's night. Sarah was left to tend to the sweet confections. Just after midnight, Sarah had crept quietly through the small, tidy kitchen and out the side door of the house. As she opened the door, a bitter gust of cold air rushed into the house. In a hurry, she left the door slightly ajar to keep quiet when she returned. She snuck out to meet her beloved, Hayden, in their secret place, just beyond the fallen trees by the creek. On the cusp of turning 18, Hayden was a tall, muscular young man with coal black hair and bright emerald eyes. He would be heading off to an apprenticeship in Lanark in 2 days. Although he would only be gone 6 months, it seemed like an eternity to Sarah. When Sarah arrived in the cozy little nook formed by a group of trees and a big rock, Hayden wasn't there. She waited for almost an hour before giving up hope and deciding to head back home. But she got lost in the dark, missing her usual landmarks that were covered by heaps of snow. Frost sat on a stump looking over the wintry forest. It shattered beneath him from the cold. Surprised, a human woman stumbled and tripped out of the forest and into the clearing beside Frost. Blackened skin tipped her nose, and her fingers, pale and numb, were turning purple at the tips. Trying to pull herself to her feet using the stump of an old tree, she looked up from where she had tripped to see Frost caressing the tips of her fingers. She gasped in shock as Frost playfully lunged at her, his teeth coming within inches of her blistered and swollen nose. Laughing carelessly at her shivering form, Frost's frightful stare was indifferent and cold. She spoke clouds of hot mist into the cold air.
What? Who are you?
Frost paused for a long moment, thinking, them mortals usually have 2 names, and so he thought he should have another.
Well, some have called me Winter, and others Cold, or Blizzard, or Ice. But if you want my true name, I am Jack of the Frost, mortal. Who are you?
She shivered as the cold of his touch spread up her hand.
I am Sarah of Creekbriar. It's a town not too far from here.
She trailed off, looking doubtful and hopeless.
I hope...
Jack smiled wide, and Sarah thought the reflection made his teeth look like sharp, pointy icicles.
Is that so? Well, I do think I know the way to Creekbriar, Sarah. Why don't you follow me and see if we can't get you somewhere safe? It is not too far, and I think it might be time for me to visit with your people. You see, I have been around for a while, but I just don't go into town much. Perhaps that should change.
Jack?
Sarah asked in an uncertain tone.
Yes, little mortal?
Jack of the Frost's voice was distracted as he thought over the next steps.
Do you hear that? I think it may be sleigh bells. Maybe my parents have come to find me.
Sarah asked hopefully. Looking around, Jack Frost had disappeared. A gust of bitter cold wind blew a torrent of snow into the darkness of the forest. The crisp, jingling sound of the bells, cheerful and festive, resonated as it passed overhead, and Sarah saw a shape move through the clouds. When the sound was gone and the silence returned, she made her way back to the road. Jack spoke from behind her.
That man never leaves me be. I will have to move again. But Sarah, thank you. I think I will always remember you. You'll want to go left now. Your father's house is to the right, but I think you left the door open and something might have happened there. You'll want to go directly and see the constable in town about it.
Sarah heard the sleigh bells once more, and frost again blew away in a puff of snow and bitter cold. As she stumbled back to town following Jack of the Frost's advice, her eyes were drawn to an unusual shape just off the path in a small clearing. Thinking that it might be an injured animal, she was compelled to investigate. Whatever it was, a snowdrift almost obscured it from sight. As she approached, she realized it was no animal. The closer she got, the more human it became. When she finally reached the figure, with horror, she saw that it was Hayden. His body, almost hidden by the snowdrift, was cold and lifeless under the unyielding winter's night. Stars of ice grew in the shape of clasped hands around his neck. Hayden's eyes seemed to have burst from the inside with little spikes of ice. His fingernails were broken and bloody where they were still attached. Bits of his bone poked through the blackened fingertips. Dark blood stained his chin where he had bit through his own tongue. Hayden's legs looked like the time Sarah had seen Tom Alderson fall from the top of the church tower after fixing the bell. Bones jutted out from his once muscular frame. Sarah's scream ripped through the night and broke the wintry silence. When the dogs in town started to bark, people reported to the constable that the scream had come from the Parson Fletcher's house. They put together a party and walked the short trip out of town. They found Sarah's frostbitten body cradling Hayden's broken form. Her tears had frozen her eyelids shut and created crystalline tracks down her face. The sight of the young couple and the sounds of her broken wails haunted the men of Creekbriar every winter for decades whenever they closed their eyes. Unfortunately, their night of horror was not over yet. A few stayed to help escort Sarah back to town as she wept about something happening at home. The group decided to leave Hayden's body for the night. The snow would preserve what was left of him for the burial in the next morning. With great hesitance, the constable led the party into the Fletchers' once idyllic home. The front door was locked, but the men could smell something burning inside and quickly went to the side door. There, the door was wide open. The snow had begun to cover the floor inside. Thick, billowing smoke poured from the oven, and the constable had one of his men open the oven and toss the blackened sweetbread into the yard. Coughing through the light haze of smoke in the house, the group began to spread out through the small home to find out what Sarah had been so upset about. It wasn't until the constable opened the door to the parson's bedroom that he discovered the cruelty visited upon the family. Parson Matthias Fletcher was suspended on massive icicles growing like stalagmites several feet towards the ceiling. Thick blood coated the icicles. The freezing temperatures meant that the blood didn't even get to the floor before freezing along the spikes. The placement of the icicles, and more importantly, the hours spent removing them from the parson's body, would lead to the constable's early retirement. Matthias's groin, eyes, throat, heart, and liver all had to be chipped off the ice over the course of several days as the supernaturally strong ice had hardened to near unbreakable density. Matthias Fletcher's legs dangled limply, but his hands had been run through the spikes below his eyes, leading the constable to believe the poor man had been alive when the attack occurred. This, more than the incredible violence done to the man, broke the constable. Lydia Fletcher was not in any better state. She lay face down on the floor beside the bed. Her back had burst open from the extreme temperature, and her skin had peeled away from the spine towards her arms. The one saving grace for the poor men who found the couple was the nightgown she wore. It kept her remaining modesty and prevented her skin from peeling any farther, as the blood that soaked the gown had frozen solid immediately. The skin of her legs and arms did not have the same barrier and looked like sheafs of parchment that had been wetted and left to air dry to the hardened curl, split, torn, and exposing the parts of a person only a surgeon or a god should ever see. When Jack of the Frost gathered himself back together, he stood atop a mountain that did not yet have a name. He looked out at the lands below him and found people were starting to settle there. These people were new to the land, coming from the eastern oceans, sailing for harrowing months across the ocean in a desperate struggle to find a place of their own. Here, he would do the same, and with so much forest and mountains that St. Nicholas of Bari couldn't hunt him down so easily. Jack of the Frost had found himself a people who could be his, looking for something new, cold hearts willing to suffer the privations of winter for what they wanted. On the other hand, the Macquarie had built a settlement here long ago, but he could make that an advantage as well. And of all the ancients, Serifax was unlikely to care or even notice that Jack of the Frost had settled above him. Their domains did not cross, and much would have to happen to create a conflict between the ancients of the seasons and the ancients of the lands. Jack further considered that here, in this new land, the people would lack sweets to keep out the bitter cold, and they likely couldn't afford to spend time making sleigh bells to stave off the quiet. There was nothing to be done about the fire, though. All the mortals had been on that path for far too long. So, children, we must be wary of Jack of the Frost. Unlike other ancients, his name is used often by mortals, so he's unlikely to notice us saying his name. But his presence in the mountains around us and the curse he placed upon the Macquarie so long ago means we must be very careful in other ways. Stay warm, use fire, fur, and spells to keep the ancient from touching you. Eat things that are sweet. Their sweetness staves off the bitter cold that he cursed upon us. And never travel at night in the cold without sleigh bells. The sound breaks the quiet of the dark and carries the chance Jack of the Frost might mistake us for his enemy, St. Nicholas. Sarah laid in the dark, agony racing through her heart. The Millers had taken her in. James Miller was her father's closest friend and been there when they found her parents. Loneliness, fear, and pain making a potent mixture for a Christmas gift. Sarah's face burned where the warmth tried to spread to her nose. Her fingers felt like she had dipped them into molten glass, and her sorrow rolled in her chest. Her eyes wanted to close, but she was terrified that she would see poor Hayden. So she kept them open and let the fiery tears keep them wet. It was hours after the constable had come back to tell her she was all alone in the world when she heard a sound break the solemn winter night. She tried to scream again, thinking that whatever had killed her beloved and family might be trying to come back. But her throat seized from the hours of screaming and sobbing. Panic was at least a different emotion, she noted idly in the back of her mind.
The Ravens Vail podcast is a production of Small Raven Media. Today's story was written by Jared Bolden-Greer, and the story was directed and narrated by Ed Bolden-Greer. The voice of the McCory was performed by Presley King. The voice of Sarah Fletcher was performed by Veronica Williams. The voices of Jack of the Frost and Saint Nick were performed by Jared Bolden-Greer. Audio engineering and sound design by Nick Devan at Nicky D Sound. Copyrighted 2024 Small Raven Media. All rights reserved.
Epilogue. Soon, the tinkle and jingle of bells broke through her terror, and she thought of that shape that raced overhead earlier. Then the bells stopped. She waited, terrified, alone, and in excruciating agony, knowing she couldn't call out for help, even if she needed to. Her eyes finally demanded that she blink, and when the flash of Hayden's wretched end flickered away, there was a figure standing next to the bed. A tall man with a curly white beard stood beside her, looking down with pity and regret plain on his face. His eyes began to water, and he knelt beside the bed, taking in Sarah's distraught expression and frostbitten face. And he spoke sadly.
I am truly so sorry, Sarah Fletcher. You and your family did not deserve this. If I could, I would bring them back. But that is beyond anyone but a true God. Instead, I will take away your pain and restore your body. And I will take away the bad memories. You'll wake tomorrow, and you will still not have your family nor Hayden. You'll be able to remember them and the good times. But at least you won't remember finding him, or question if there was anything more you could have done. There will only be certainty that you did everything you could. Now, Sarah, sleep. Have the merriest Christmas you can, Sarah. Good night.